I am standing here on the John Herbst farm property, and this is going to... Okay, this is going to be the Emmanuel Harmon farm, part 6, the flank, over in Meals Orchard on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. On part 5, we left off the Emmanuel Harmon farm, which is in the distance here, beyond the Fairfield Road. This is the Fairfield Road, and Park Avenue is here to the right. The Emmanuel Harmon farm would be directly toward my north off of the Old Mill Road. Now, on the morning of July 1st, as John F. Reynolds and the 1st Corps made their arrival to Gettysburg, and we covered this in an older video series, the 1st Corps and John F. Reynolds arrived up the Emmitsburg Road. And then when they got to the Nicholas Corridori farm, the troops took a more westerly direction. If we look here, this is the Cumberland Township Municipal Building or police station here. If you were to, which was part of the Henry Meals Orchard in 1863. In the distance, a few miles back here beyond the woods, is the Nicholas Corridori barn. So Reynolds and the 1st Corps actually made their way up in this direction. When they got to the Nicholas Corridori farm, the 1st Corps soldiers actually made a more westerly route toward Seminary Ridge, while John Reynolds continued further and went through the town. And we covered those in both the video series, the 1st Corps arrival at Gettysburg, and For God's Sake Forward, For God's Sake Forward, the arrival of John F. Reynolds. However, Biddle's brigade, under Colonel Chapman Biddle, went into a more direct northwest direction and came across the Corridori farm more toward the northwest in this direction and came out right here in Meals Orchard. He did not follow the rest of the Corps. Now, he came out here near the Fairfield Road. He crossed over the lines of the 8th Illinois Cavalry, and they were on the flank of the attack on the Emmanuel Harmon farm, which is directly in front of us. The 8th Illinois Cavalry was on the Union's left flank, and they advanced northwest in this direction toward the Stall-Smith farm. There they seen Fry's brigade, and they moved east but then they turned east rather toward the town of Gettysburg after seeing the Confederate troops at the Stall-Smith farm. This may have been a mistake because they had the Confederates flanked on their right flank at that point. And had they continued the advance, the 8th Illinois Cavalry and Biddle's brigade, some of the actions and maybe even the possible burning of the Emmanuel Harmon farm may not have happened. And it may have even changed the battle on the first day here at Gettysburg. This has been 7, the fight at the Harmon House. Now, sharpshooters from Pettigrew's division had taken a position inside of the Emmanuel Harmon house and barn. And they began to kill and wound many of the men from Colonel Chapman Biddle's brigade. Now, General Wadsworth, who was taking notice of this, he rode up to Colonel Theodore B. Gates, who was in command of the 20th New York State Militia, and he directed him to send a company to take the Harmon house. Now, Theodore Gates and the 20th New York Militia was here on the John Herbst property, which you see here in front of us. And he sent Captain Ambrose N. Baldwin and Company K of the 20th New York State Militia in this direction in front of our camera, crossing Willoughby Run here in the distance and heading directly toward the Emmanuel Harmon house, which then had been taken over by the Confederate sharpshooters. Crossing the run while they were skirmishing, they crossed a steep ravine, which is the ravine you see just here in the distance, the Harmon house being behind us in the property. Crossing the run and going up that steep ravine, they made their way to the Harmon house. Skirmishing very heavily, they were able to finally take over the ground, get to the door of the house, and they began to bang the door and yelling inside for them to unbolt the door or they would break it down. Of course, they did tear into the house. And they took possession of that house as a skirmishing zone of protection. Now the tables had turned on those North Carolinians who had occupied it just minutes ago. This has been the Emmanuel Harmon Farm, Part 7, The Fight at the Harmon House, here on the banks of Willoughby Run at the John Herbst Farm on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. In here on Country Club Road, directly in front of us here in the distance where the stop sign is the Old Mill Road, and then in this direction would be Route 30. And I'm standing here on the edge of the Harmon Farm. In Part 7 we had talked about how the members of the 80th New York State Militia had sent 2 companies out, and some men were able to take over the Harmon house and use it as sharpshooters, driving Confederates back into this position. These Confederates were probably members of the 52nd North Carolina Pettigrew's Brigade. Here in the woods behind us, they had reformed. To our north, Brockenball's division led off the attack, the final attack here on the Harmon Farm. And the attack started to our north with Brockenball's brigade, and also standing here just a few moments later would be the 52nd North Carolina, where I'm standing now. Now, Colonel James K. Marshall was the colonel of the 52nd North Carolina. He was positioned just along the Mill Road right over here, directly west of the Harmon Farm. Union skirmishers from the 80th New York State Militia were firing from the Harmon Farm, which was just several hundred yards here in front of us, from the second floor window and from near a chimney. Now, the 26th North Carolina to our left over here was a witness to this harassing fire coming from the Emmanuel Harmon farmhouse. In fact, they said that the regiments were annoyed by the sharpshooting that were in a old, large farmhouse, stone farmhouse, to our right, and that's coming from the 26th North Carolina here. Now, these skirmishers that were from the New York State Militia continued to fire from the second-story window of the house, some of the outbuildings, and near the chimney. And Colonel Burgwin of the 26th North Carolina ordered a man who was a great shot within the regiment to take them down. The volunteer that volunteered was a man named Lieutenant J.A. Lowe of Company G. He volunteered. And what Lowe did was he took a route very close to where we're walking now, along an old fence, and he began crawling on the ground along this fence until he came into sight of the Harmon house and the property. He then was able to observe what was going on, and he seen several men on the second story of this house and near the chimney that were firing amongst these regiments of this North Carolina brigade. And the witnesses says that after a few minutes he was able to silence them, most likely meaning he picked them off, he killed them. Now, we're walking along what may have been that fence line today here. And of course, the outbuildings of the Harmon house and farm all stood right in here. This is from behind what would have been the house. All of a sudden, back to where we began walking from, along what is today Country Club Road, the order came. The attacks began. Brockenball to the left or the north began forward with his Virginia Brigade, followed by the brigade in which the 52nd North Carolina was a part of, Pettigrew's North Carolina Brigade. The order went out. Attention, brigade, forward, march. And the march began. As the men began marching, as we are walking forward today, the 52nd North Carolina approached the Harmon house. And as they approached the house here, Company E surrounded the house and the buildings and began to set fire to the outbuildings. At this point, when the fire began to sweep over these outbuildings, the New Yorkers withdrew from the house. Now, Colonel Marshall, James K. Marshall, the 52nd, then ordered the house to be burned to prevent further use as a sharpshooter's nest. As the men approached in the house, Amelia Harmon and Rachel Feinfrock, her aunt, were inside the house and were trying to extinguish the flames to their home. And the house, the barn, and the wash house, which were now all aflame, and there was black smoke pouring high into the sky above this house. This has been Part 8 of the Emmanuel Harmon Farm, the firing of the farm, here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is the Emmanuel Harmon Farm, Part 9, the advance toward Willoughby Run, here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. As the farm barn outbuildings were in flames, the 52nd North Carolina, Pettigrew's Brigade, and Brockenball's Brigade to the left or north began forward here toward Willoughby Run. On the right, the 8th Illinois Cavalry continued to harass these brigades, and Company B of the 52nd North Carolina was sent out to deal with the 8th Illinois. Now, as Brockenball and Pettigrew's brigades crossed the Harmon farm here eastward, Scales and Perrin's brigade filed in behind them in support. To the south, over here, behind the burning Harmon farm, Archer's Fry's brigade and Lane's brigade covered the Fairfield Road. Now, all these brigades eventually would go forward here in the distance and cross Willoughby Run into the John Herbst farm and woods, and where they would crash right into Biddle's brigade and, of course, the 121st Pennsylvania over there on Seminary Ridge, and thus would end the fight on the Harmon farm, because not again would the Confederates cross Willoughby Run again until July 4th during their retreat. This has been the Emmanuel Harmon Farm, the final advance across the Harmon farm after the burning of the buildings, here Part 9 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. The Emmanuel Harmon Farm video series Part 10. The Horse Railway, or the Gettysburg Springs Railway, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we're looking at the ground here on the western end of the Gettysburg Springs Railway, also known as the Horse Railway. Now, this was a railway wagon road bed that had its beginnings in 1867. 1868 and 1869 as the Kaling Springs and the Springs Hotel, which in the distance, just beyond the tree line there in front of us, was built. And it was a way for early tourists just after the battle to go to the springs and drink from the miracle waters that were there. And there once sat a railroad cut railway bed in a wagon road right here where we're looking at today. Here, just in the center of the camera, you can see what looks like truck tracks. And then you can see a do not enter sign. That is the old Stone Avenue, which comes out here to Reynolds Woods today. And the horse railway actually started up in town near the Lincoln train station, went down toward the square, west on what is today Chambersburg Street, West 30. And then when it got to where today Springs Avenue is the original remnant of the roadbed of the Gettysburg Horse Railway, or the Gettysburg Springs Railway. And Springs Avenue led right up here toward the Lutheran Theological Seminary, which you can see there in the front of us. It passed just by the side of the seminary and along today where this road comes right by here, and then went right across just to the left of where John F. Reynolds was killed. Down near the 19th Indiana Monument, it crossed Willoughby Run, and some of the stones from the original bridge still sit there at the banks of Willoughby Run. And then it crossed Willoughby Run right by the spring and then into a little circle by the hotel. So this has been the Old Horse Railroad as part of our Emmanuel Harmon Farm video series, Part 10, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.